Hello, this is Taha.
This is Anaina,
This is Masala.
and we're here to yap at you about films we watched recently.
And today we're doing something a bit different. We're doing a rundown of horror in 2025.
Oh no, my daughter's blind.
Oh, is she here?
No, she's passed.
Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. You didn't know. It's not your fault.
How'd she die?
Piper.
She's okay. She's drowned.
Basically, there was a few horror films I've watched that I was not able to recap, mainly like Together, Weapons, Bring Her Back. And that really got me thinking that I have been watching more horror now, like in cinemas. And that's firstly because it's just more easier for me to watch that now compared to like 3 years ago or whatever. But also, like, I do feel it's much more interesting and more original things have been coming out that keep wanting me to go back.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
again, not a unknown fact that I can't do it. So I'm glad one of us is.
Yeah. And it's just not me as well. Like, I feel films like Sinners and Weapons have been doing really well in the box office, right? And it's also true that horror is just genuinely doing well, especially when you look at original films specifically, right? Like, if you eliminate all of the sequels, things based on franchises, superhero stuff like that, a lot of original films that are done well have been horror,
Yeah.
right? So I wanted to look at what connects some specific horror films that came out in 2025, right? Which include Sinners. We've talked to lengths about Sinners. Everybody knows what Sinners is, but basically Ryan Coogler's films about like the power of music and vampires in the Deep South. Weapons, Zach Kreger's film about these children who go missing and the town trying to basically deal with that and try to find them. Together, starring James Franco and Alison Brie, as they find this mysterious cave and find themselves like fusing into one another. And Bring Her Back, which is the Philippa Brothers sequel to Talk to Me, and basically deals with a lot of grief around deaths of family and stuff like that, right? So I wanted to look at those films. What did I want to look at? I focused on four main themes. So I'll have the occult and strangers. I want to talk about autonomy versus togetherness. I want to talk about the weaponization of grief in these films and the breakdown of traditional institutions. Also, I've tried to focus on these four themes, and each theme is very specific to one specific film, but does apply to all of them, right? So are we ready?
Absolutely.
So yes, feels a bit more like a academic essay, but hopefully a good academic essay that you enjoy listening to, that you didn't have to write. So, it's not a burden. So starting off with Strangers and the Occult. So Strangers and the Occult is very specific to Sinners, but again, like I'll say, applies to all of them. All of these films have an outside force that comes into like our protagonists or like the main characters' lives, right? All of these forces are in some ways also tied to occult, mysterious, like demonic or some level of forces, right? Sinners has vampires, Weapons has Gladys, who's a witch, Together has this cult from a cave, and Bring Her Back also has a cult which is resurrecting the dead. And this is very important when you consider how occults are traditionally used to show something foreign, mysterious, something that you can't understand, something that is this mysterious force that is something our protagonists often struggle to tackle with, like in any mainstream way. Also, that it's true within all these films that the character or force does not cause the issue, but often exacerbates it, right? This is again where Gladys preys on the town's neglect, Together preys on the insecurity of the relationship. Bring Her Back uses the flaws in the care system to exacerbate its issues. In Sinners, the vampires take racism to their advantage and also like this yearning for freedom and like security for Black people, right?
So basically, what you're saying is like in these films, the occult aspect of it, as it is represented, is a metaphor for something larger.
Yes, I'll come to like how all of these tie into each other, but it also comes across that strangers also have an ideology that promises to do good but is ultimately self-serving. The protagonists fall for this ideology or at least worsen their issues. This creates further issues. It's also true that the outside forces are either directly influencing these characters by taking advantage of their flaws or through like some magical means. And lastly, that there is always a character in some of these films that either sympathizes with the stranger or overlooks their danger, right? You have the principal in Gladys, you have the clan members in Vampires with Sinners, you have Wendy with Laura in Bring Her Back, and you have Millie with the Cults in Together. So when you look at this very specifically in horror, this is not a new thing. A stranger danger thing has always been a prevalent thing in horror. But you can see that all four films have this thing that the horror or like the stranger is an outside force, but it permeates it. It's not a serial killer trying to kill you, it's someone using you to kill yourself. But I think there's a common thing of like how all of our protagonists feel into some ways tied to like this sense of someone coming into their lives and wrecking it. Now moving on to autonomy versus togetherness. This is the most prominent theme in Together, but it again like comes together in all of these films, right? It the sphere of commitment and loss of autonomy become the horrifying things. Central examples: there's a central fear of dependency within Together, the couple, right? In Sinners, there's a thing of assimilation framed
Yeah.
as this loss of freedom, right? And costing your autonomy and identity. Then in Bring Her Back, Andy wants autonomy for his sister and him, like outside the system to move around it, right? And then Weapons, we follow these. In Weapons, it's also in much more of a structured way where we follow four different stories that merge into one. So it's playing in that metatextual way as well. But also the town is broken apart, and then these certain characters come together. This solves that problem. So autonomy is continuously challenged in all of these films, right?
Mm-hmm.
In favor of togetherness. Oftentimes, the autonomous approach is the one that does not succeed, and togetherness does. And togetherness is something the antagonist tries to break. Again, Sinners, Bring Her Back. In all of these films, the people's dynamics, togetherness, communities being something being broken. And all films do approach this in a different way, but have this similar dynamic.
I think, as Sinners being the only one I watched, Sinners does this really specifically through music and through the musical sequences. Has two of the most prominent ones. One being the kind of time bending musical sequence that they have inside the barn, and the other one, which is that comes to mind, is like the ones that the vampires have outside when they're all
Yes.
singing and dancing together, and kind of seeing how the togetherness shifts or has shifted as like a way of upping the stakes, or kind of rather broken apart or come together against or for whatever we're planning on seeing. So I definitely see that like
Yeah.
in Sinners through the musical sequences specifically.
And in Sinners, you can, again, in any of one of these films, I could really dig deeper and explore these further. But for example, in Sinners, the specific use of the main vampire being Irish is, I think, very alluding to something like Noel Ignatieff's work on like how the Irish became white, which talks about how Irish coming into places like the US were the oppressed and then work to become an oppressive force as well in a lot of areas. And again, you have the sense of like a together between inter-community togetherness versus an autonomy. And like, so I think, yes, it's a common without these films. And again, it brings again this narrative which feels very current as well, which is a sense of community breakdown, loss of community cohesion, a want for autonomous control, a want for self-control versus a struggling for community like struggle, right? And I don't mean necessarily that even in just a sense of communities breaking down. I mean, like, it is also a struggle to genuinely want to have a self-identification, self-understanding role and stuff like that. But also, when you are working in a together, individual voices will not be as strong because they cannot be for a collective voice to rise, right? So I think that also talks about like a very current feeling that is present in the zeitgeist, right? Then I'll talk about the role of grief and loss, which I think is the most prominent in Weapons. So again, each film centers around the loss of something. It can be freedom, people, or relationship, but this loss is like a very pertinent thing that is permeated throughout the film. So you have the smokestack twins in Sinners and just racism in general, but the smokestack twins specifically trying to move past racism in some ways by establishing their own place, right? You have the death of family in Bring Her Back, you have the loss of children in Weapons, and you have the loss of freedom in Together, right? So there's always a loss of something, autonomy, cohesion, whatever. This grief and loss again then works with the outsider force, tying that back in, right? Because this grief and loss is taken advantage by the outside force to cause divisions, to cause problems, right? And there's a constant theme of the characters trying to solve their grief in some way. Again, like I mentioned, there's twins in Sinners trying to earn their way out of racism or like those issues, right? Sally Hawkins' character, Laura, in Bring Her Back, trying to physically bring back her daughter from the dead. In Weapons, where Josh Brolin character has rage and wants to find his son by any means. And again, in Together, where they're like, oh, so if we separate, if we do this, we'll be fine. Again, it never really works and does often serves to exacerbate the problem. Also, this is a very interesting thing where the grief is always in the present and the solution is either in the past or in the future.
Okay.
And that seems very vague when I say it like that. But what I mean is the characters are either trying to go back to something that was, again, all our Weapons or Bring Her Back, or move into something that they have not achieved yet,
Yeah.
right? Again, Sinners or Together. It's trying to always like move out of here into this perceived notion of what the past was, of the future will be, right? Instead of acknowledging what the present is. And this trauma is something that the characters are working through in each film, and it's never fully resolved, right? So it again, the present past thing is what I really want to grasp on with the trauma, because saying horror films have trauma or are centered on trauma is like one of the most basic one-on-one analysis to do. That's not what I want to say. Every horror film throughout the world, throughout all time, has reflected current trauma in some way.
It's like saying a dog barks.
Yes. What I really want to highlight here is this continuing sense that the trauma is in a lot of places in the past or in this hypothetical future, but never in trying to resolve the trauma in the present, or even like an acknowledgement of trying to work through the trauma in the present, right? And that causing this further fracturing and being taken advantage of. I think that's really important. It's the temporality within that, and also how it's being taken advantage of each time. It gives an opening for these forces to come
You're
in.
basically describing what Judith Butler talks about in her book, Frames of War.
Frames of War, yeah.
Yeah, and basically the like tagline to that is, when is life grievable? And she explains basically all of this, and she uses like the image and kind of the internet in some places, and like the development of the image and the internet, and kind of how it progresses and how it makes things accessible now, but kind of postpones feelings like grief, or kind of keeps it dwelling so much on what has already happened or what can happen, that makes the present so problematic, and like you're unable to deal with it, which then whatever the perceived threat is or whatever the threat was, it just gets worse. So like the exacerbation that you were talking about is like a big part of that as well, because it is this very grief that is kind of unattainable or unfelt.
Exactly. Judith Butler mentioned take a shot.
I mean, you've got to drop them wherever you can.
Yeah. And lastly, what I want to talk about is this breakdown of traditional institutions, which I feel comes down the most in something like Bring Her Back for me. Okay. So like social atomization I've mentioned is something that throughout the film, right? And it comes back again with the sync of like autonomy and togetherness, how it all connects, all these themes connect back into each other. It's also true that in each film, the protagonist is hurt by the current social paradigm, right? So the racism in Sinners, in Together, it's the breakdown of marital structures, because like, for example, I'm forgetting the character's name, but Alison Brie's character is the one who proposes, despite being like the women in the relationship. And this sense of like Dave Franco's character not being able to drive or not being as independent as a man should be. So there's a lot of breakdown of like traditional marital and like gender roles and stuff like that. In the Weapons, there is a sense of like the police is failing, the teachers are failing, and stuff like that. And again, lastly, in Bring Her Back, where the social care system, it has failed these children as well. So there is a current institution of these social institutions failing, right? And in some ways, it is the social institutions that breed expectations as well. Again, you can see that throughout the film, Sinners and all of that. And at a certain times, it is the breakdown of these institutions that causes the problems, right? But it is these institutions in some way hampering our characters, and always they are in disrepair, whether they've always been in disrepair or they've fallen into disrepair, right? That's changes, but it's always the case that they're in disrepair. And the outside force, again, the occult, the stranger, takes advantage of that, right? The characters are always trying to escape this broken institution, right? So you have multiple examples. You have the teacher in Weapons who's trying to like going into alcoholism and stuff to kind of escape from her problems, right? Like I mentioned, Smoke Captains with racism, again, trying to escape that problem, trying to run away from it in some ways. Then you have Together, where they're trying to again separate and not really resolve this tension that exists within the dynamic and bring her back again, where like I mentioned, Andy wants to take his sister Piper away from and just be independent away from the system, and none of them are able to do this without significant consequence or sacrifice, right? And in this way the system itself acts like the cult as well, and reinforces like and breaks these people. I'm not saying the society institutions are the same as the cult, but they help the occult grow. They become a system for the occult, even inadvertently or deliberately, right? And again, if I say the breakdown of societal institutions, that feels like the most modern thing ever. But again, it's also important to recognize that people have been saying this for like ages, right? This is not a new thing either. But it is how, again, everything feels like all of our characters live in a crumbling world, in a very real world, affected by
Mm-hmm.
very real issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like The Purge where there's a fictional law enacted and people are coming to kill you. It's a very real world in all of these films, even when there are fantasy elements, because it highlights very real societal failures that happen
Yeah.
and how they breed these further problems from it because they are unfixed, right? And I think it also the idea of none of them able to do anything to the system without great consequence or sacrifice. Even in the end of any of them, the system necessarily is very, at most, it's like maybe better, but never like fixed, right? And they lose a lot, which again just highlights this fight to fix things and the cost that it entails in like the modern world, right? So
Yeah.
this is like the main four things that I get from all of these songs. And you can see that when you connect all four, they connect really well. And the films share a message of like how contemporary fear and anxiety looks less like a jump scare and more of an institutional failure, right? Where the grief is political and society demand a certain sense of sacrifice from you that can be very painful. And I think that is also what I want to really the reason these films have been very connective is because I personally feel like, again, my politics are left leaning, sure, but I think you can very much look at all of this and not make it apolitical, but see it works in a very conservative and liberal mindset, right? Where the breakdown of traditional institutions is something conservatives will also talk about, the loss of autonomy and togetherness, the feeling of grief, the feeling of outsiders coming in is like an immigration talking point 101. But you can same thing turn it on the head and turn it
Yeah.
into a liberal thing.
Which to me makes it really interesting that 2025 is the year that a lot of these films have been released, because this is the year that we really saw a breakdown of kind of the global institutions and political institutions and social institutions around us, or rather those like failures and those breakdowns got fully cemented. So I think it's really interesting that these films came out specifically now and that they can be read from, I mean, sure, believer of anything can be read from any perspective as long as you believe in that perspective strongly enough. So it doesn't surprise me that, you know, these rhetorics can be read from both ends of the political spectrum. But what I think to me more interesting, as you're pointing it out, is that these like horrific things, the things that are terrifying people in these movies, aren't so far off from reality, which is the actually terrifying part. And I think that's more scary than any jump scare, wacky ass looking doll.
Yeah, exactly. They leave you a sense of dread that feels more real.
For sure.
And again, it connects with a lot of people because you might attribute it to different things, but that certain fear is in its generalness, in some ways, is very relatable to so many people currently. So
For sure.
yeah, basically, I feel this is like the grand summary of horror in 2025. There'll be more horror films. There's some horror films I didn't talk about, something like Final Destination, Bloodlines, but I think you can also take a lot of grief and loss and stuff like that within that film as well. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode very specifically because I really love talking about like films in this more analytical approach where you take your time and like look at them and really dig down into what they're talking about. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast is produced solely by us with musical assets from Pixabay. If you enjoyed this, please do share it. See you again next time.
Bye.